Tonight, the Incom Corporation is under investigation for allegedly supplying starfighters to those systems in the rebellion.
And a special report, furious furballs, Endor natives demand Senate representation. Again, that story and Galactic Lotto numbers at 11.
Welcome back, you slimy, double-crossing, no-good swindlers, to another episode of Hoth Topics. I am your Stormtrooper Corps Captain Ian, and joining me this week is your Scarif Rebel Trooper, John. John, welcome back to the podcast. How are you doing, sir?
Why are you welcoming me back? I'm on it every week.
We don't know. We don't know what you do during the week. We don't know if there's secret episodes out there that I secretly record by myself that you're not on, just in case something goes terribly wrong, like it did with me when I was, dying from stones in my...
Your kidneys?
Yeah, my kidneys. Not fun. But I'm better now, and I am here with you again to talk more about Star Wars.
Oh, I like that thing.
I know, it's a thing we both enjoy. Last week we talked about Solo, and one of the things that you mentioned was some of the new costumes that are going to be coming out in the film.
Yes.
Now, we've mentioned it a few times. You are a costume builder and prop builder, and you do a lot of prop work and costume work in Star Wars. What I thought we'd do today is kind of go over some of your experiences building costumes and some of our experiences at Wondercon. We'll have a guest later on. Katie will be joining us, who went with us to Wondercon as Rose Tico. And then we have a couple questions from some listeners about costuming in general. And we did a couple interviews as well with some of the more popular costuming groups. Let's start out with your experiences in costuming. Give us a little background about how you got into it and developed the skills.
It kind of started off in a weird place. It had really nothing to do with costumes, but what it was, I guess you could call it a kind of costume. In middle school and high school, I was really into the punk rock scene, and there's a very strong DIY, make-your-own clothes kind of ethic that goes on in there. From when I was like 13 to 14, I learned how to sew by hand, and then, kind of designing clothes and stuff, which is fun, I guess.
Hey, it taught you how to do sewing and things that I don't know how to do, so.
I didn't really get into actual costuming until, I'd say, about 2009-ish. I think the second or third San Diego Comic-Con I went to, a few of my friends got really into the steampunk aesthetic. We threw together our own little airship crew with very, very basic costumes, Victorian-looking costumes. I think that's probably where the love of making costumes and props came from, especially in the steampunk community. The only thing it really has in common with the punk community is that whole DIY mindset. And so we didn't want to go out and buy commercially available costumes. Mm-hmm. We wanted to make everything by hand. So, go to a thrift store, pick up some clothing, take it home, rip it apart, pull out a sewing machine, sew it back together. The steampunk props is a lot of wood, a lot of brass and metal and leather, and so learning how to use different hand tools.
So what made you switch to Star Wars costuming projects from the steampunk?
Like with any kind of genre, I guess you could say, at some point it gets a little popular. The scene, I guess you can say, gets flooded with new people that have caught on to the popular thing. And that's kind of what happened for me and my friends, is that it got a little mainstream, and you started to be able to get these mass-produced costumes and pieces available, and it seemed like everyone and their mother was doing steampunk stuff. It kind of lost its charm for us when we were spending so much time working so hard and spending months working on costumes, and you could go to Target and buy a steampunk ensemble. So we started looking for other things to do, specifically at Comic-Con and other cons. Most of us already had an affinity for Star Wars, so it wasn't that hard of a jump into making Star Wars costumes, or making things that were in the same vein, sci-fi-ish type things.
Right. It's interesting that you mentioned that the steampunk got very mainstream. You could consider Star Wars very mainstream as well. However, I think that the key difference there is that there's still a lot of love and craftsmanship that goes into making a lot of these Star Wars costumes, even though there are commercially available alternatives.
Right. And I think that the difference is Star Wars started mainstream, where with the steampunk, it was kind of like a small thing, very tight-knit community. But Star Wars, it started off as a worldwide phenomenon. It never was indie to begin with. It kind of feels like, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think I'm catching on to what you're saying. Why don't you talk about some of your favorite projects that you've been working on?
I think the first actual Star Wars costume I made was for you, Ian, which is you'd asked me to try to make you a Imperial officer's jacket. So I think what had happened is I was making a steampunk, like an airship captain's uniform.
Yeah, that's right.
I based it off of a Civil War officer's jacket, not thinking clearly, just thinking of my costume. I had made it gray, and when I had finished it, I realized I had made a Confederate jacket.
Oops.
However, I did learn that style of jacket was very similar to what the Imperial officers wore, so I think when you saw that, and I was like, oh, hey, I think this can be modified into making an officer's uniform. I think that's when you asked to make it for you.
Yeah.
Since I still had the patterns laying around. I think what really got me into the whole thing with Star Wars is once I started looking at that jacket and trying to figure out what I needed to do to modify it and make it correct, I discovered dozens of forums specifically dedicated to just making an officer's uniform. I think like the two biggest sites that helped me out were a forum called RPF, or the Replica Prop Forum, I think. I should probably have researched this. RPF is a collection of thousands of prop makers around the world helping each other figure out how to make props for movies and other media, and like it's almost step-by-step build guides in some cases. And then the other fantastic resource is the 501st Legion's Costuming Group's forums. All their resources are divided up by the different detachments. So for your costume, the Imperial Officers Forum was a fantastic resource. Looking for, where I needed to sew the right darts in, or what kind of clasps to use to close the front of the tunic.
And it came out really well. I still regularly wear that costume to events. I wore it to Wondercon. I've worn it to premieres. We'll throw some photos up in the linked up of all these projects so people can kind of get a sense of what they look like.
On our website, hothtopicspodcast.com, a few posts back, I did a kind of a primer for this episode when it was going to come out on time until Ian got sick.
I had stones in my kidneys.
I linked some images of what we're talking about today in there too, and I'm sure we'll throw up some more in the link descriptions and such.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the next Star Wars costume that you worked on was for our friend Catherine, and you made a very interesting custom costume with her.
She wanted to do a Rey costume from
Force Awakens.
Thank you. Why can I? It's too late. Too much Taco Bell.
Too much Taco Bell.
So she wanted to do a Rey costume, and I thought, this movie just came out the year before. We're going to see hundreds of Reys, especially since there was commercially available costumes everywhere. It's a pretty simple costume to make. I took a picture of Rey in Photoshop, and I just inverted all the colors. Maybe not inverting is the right word, but I took all the light colors and made them dark. And eventually we decided to go with a Sith or dark side Rey. So instead of the browns and beiges, it was blacks and grays. I think at that time we all assumed, because Rey was proficient in his staff, that she was going to end up with a double-sided lightsaber in Last Jedi. What I did for her particular staff is I got a hold of a couple old Darth Maul Force Effects lightsabers, chopped out all the innards, and created a staff that collapsed into a double-sided lightsaber. Instead of the blade emitting from the hilt, the blade emitted... it's hard to explain.
That was a really interesting, because I was helping you brainstorm how to actually make that collapsing effect work.
Right.
Because the physics of it was something of a challenge. And what you eventually did is you had the halves that were the top of the blade held in with tension screws, and you just colored the parts of the blade that would have been visible when those sides were held up. And then when you took those tension screws out and pushed them towards the middle where they met, the red blade is underneath. Yeah. So it was a really impressive build.
Basically, when looking at pictures of her staff, we realized that the ends of the staff look very similar to the emitter side of Darth Maul's lightsaber.
Very similar,
so I think that's where it took off from. The staff itself was just the polycarbonate blades, so the staff was actually really, really bendy, especially with the two metal hilts tension screwed secured to the end of the blades.
It was very wibbly.
But when you undid those screws and you pulled those hilts towards each other, it created a cool double-sided lightsaber.
And you had rewired some of the innards so that it still lit up.
I took out the soundboard. There just wasn't room for it. I wired the LED string lights inside the polycarbonate blades just straight to a battery.
So the staff was a really cool part of that costume, and Catherine got a lot of comments on that. You also made a second kind of bonus prop.
I was at a Michael's Arts and Crafts store and found a 12-inch diameter foam half sphere. And I was like, oh, this looks like the size of BB-8's head. So I took it home. I carved out the panels in the styrofoam. I repainted it. BB-8's actual colors. Made the islands. I'm not sure what technically that's called on a droid unit.
The optics.
Oh, see, that makes so much sense.
This is why I'm here.
I took the optics. I smashed some plastic and glued it in there. Had a bunch of wires coming out of it. Threw a bunch of flashing different colored LEDs in there to make it look like it was shattered and broken. And we ended up strapping it around her shoulder like it was like a upper arm armor that just sat on her shoulder, blinking. And
I gotta tell you, man, when I first saw that thing, you brought it over to my house, I think, and you just walked in the door with this busted up looking BB-8 head. I'm like, what have you done and why? But once you see it on the actual costume, it looks fantastic.
When children would see the BB-8, they would get upset because it's a broken BB-8. I remember this one kid walked by and, probably 4 or 5, and she looked up at Catherine and was like, oh, she killed BB-8. And she looked right back at her and said, it's because he was misbehaving, and then just walked off. And,
I didn't know that part of the story. Puns. So you actually started making another costume. You and Catherine were working together on another one. I don't think it's finished yet. Is that correct?
As far as I know, she hasn't finish the soft parts, the cloth parts.
Mm-hmm.
She wanted a Boba Fett costume. She's a big Mando fan, but she didn't want to do the just kind of generic
traditional
Mando armor
Boba
that we're used to seeing. No offense to the guys in the Mando mercs, your custom suits are rad, and she wanted to do a Boba Fett themed costume. We took the basic design of the Empire Strikes Back version of Boba Fett, which is just mostly green. It's the only real difference, different blaster. Please don't hate me, Boba Fett people out there that know that I'm, a different shade of the visor and blah, blah, blah. But, so we took it and we feminized it a little bit. We gave the helmet more of a Sabine Wren feminine style eye-slit that you see on her helmet and that you see on some of the female Death Watch members in the Clone Wars.
Rebels as well.
Oh, thank you. I thought you were like, no, there's no Mandos in Clone Wars. Cool.
No. We need
to stop this podcast, and we got some seasons to watch. The helmet was probably the most radically different in the design. This was my first time working with EVA foam, but it's a lot of fun, and anyone can create these things, the armor and the helmet with foam, and it's super light, which is just fantastic to wear.
Now, you have one other costume that I want to get into because I think it has one of your most impressive prop builds along with it, and that is your Scarif Rebel costume. Now, this is one for you personally.
Even though you introduced me as the Scarif Rebel, And you just mentioned, we were talking about my costumes, and I'm looking at parts of it. I literally forgot that I made this costume. So
the only reason I introduced you as the Scarif Rebel is because
and I know that
I'm the only one. I only have one. I only have one costume, and it's Imperial, and I didn't want us both to be Imperials.
Yeah, that costume was a lot of fun to make. I really enjoyed Rogue One for its portrayal of combat between just regular Rebel forces and regular Imperial troops. I like the whole like Vietnam War feeling of it. But that costume was a lot of fun to build solely because when I was watching the movie, I realized that the helmets that they wear are just modified U.S. Army steel pot helmets, which I own one. I've owned it since I was a little kid and I was obsessed with military surplus. The blaster armor they wear, I recognized what they were, and I knew that one of the Army surplus stores here in San Diego had them for no apparent reason. They are mid-80s to early 90s fragmentation vests. So I went down to the surplus store. They had one of the jackets. Took it home. It was green. Not okay. So I had to dye it. Dyed it blue. I ordered it wasn't 3D printed. It was a resin cast kit for the armor that goes around the helmet. And then the rest of the costume was actually pretty easy. The jackets that they wear that have like the Corellian blood stripes down the side that aren't actually Corellian blood stripes that you see Cassian wearing and stuff. I just took a old tan Army surplus BDU jacket, printed the stripes onto a strip of fabric, and sewed that onto the sleeves. For the pants, I just dyed some cargo pants to be I think mine are a dark brown. And then the boots they're what's called Chelsea boots. Boots with ankle height boots without laces, a leather cuff around the top. I mean, that costume was really easy to make.
I think my favorite part about that costume as a whole is actually the rifle prop that you made. It's a converted Nerf gun, if I believe.
Yeah, so Nerf. I originally wanted to make it out of a airsoft M4, which is what the props are made from, and because I have tons of airsoft gear lying around, I had the parts. However, Nerf put out an A280 CFE, I believe is the model in Star Wars.
I think
blaster
you're correct.
That looks enough like it. That it could be passable with a good paint job. The only thing I added was a extended barrel with holes drilled into the PVC pipe, about inch and a half wide diameter PVC pipe, to make it look like one of the sniper variants that you see the Scarif troops running around with.
It was a really cool prop build, and it still functions as an airsoft gun too, I believe. Is that correct?
Functions as a Nerf gun.
I'm sorry, a Nerf gun. I meant to say Nerf gun. So I want to go over one more costume. We'll talk a little bit more about you made a Rose Tico costume for someone, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But your current pride and joy, a General Veers AT-AT Commander costume.
Correct.
So let's hear a little bit about that.
I really wanted to, once I found all these resources I talked about, the RPF and the 501st and the Rebel Legion, fantastic for the Scarif costume. Once I found the 501st, I got way too into the minutia of getting everything's way too correct. As much as I like where my costume is now, it's always going to be the wrong color green. That's going to bug me. But the armor has been a lot of fun to make, especially trying to come up with ways to make it look as screen accurate as possible, even though there's only a handful of screenshots of General Veers actually wearing the costume. So with this armor, the best resource I found was the 501st Armored Cavalry forum. There's a guide on there by a guy named Ruthar. It is a step-by-step build once you get a armor kit on how to build the armor piece by piece. So what websites to go to get the right buttons that you need, the random greeblies, the random 3D printed pieces. And it's been fantastic. The only drawback I've had is there's a piece on the back armor that is a plate that has a has a design on it. There's one shot of, and it's blurry, and no one can really tell what it is, and so kind of a gray area almost. Like, there's different ways that can be approved because there's just not enough screen evidence. And it's the one part of the costume that isn't completely finished on my part to actually submit it for approval, which I'm hoping to do, within a couple months.
Well, as some of you know, if you follow us on any of our social media platforms, we went to Wondercon at the end of March, and it was John and I, and we also went along with Caitlin Reed, who's joining us here via teleconference, I suppose. Hi, Katie. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing quite well.
So, you are a new guest on the show. Why don't you tell us who you are and what you do?
Hi, I'm a human.
I can confirm.
I support pro-human endeavors.
Yeah. I'm on the show because I went with them to WonderCon. I've got a YouTube channel. It's Kate the Slightly Great on YouTube. Kate with a C.
Links in the show notes.
Like, I'm not sure what else you want me to say. Like, do you want me to give you my whole life backstory, or?
No, it's all right. Just anything you wanted people to know.
Okay. I'm dating Ian.
Yeah, I guess that's a good thing to disclose.
Nepotism.
I know, right? It's the only reason I'm on this podcast.
So we all went to WonderCon, and we did so in costume. All three of the costumes were made mostly by John.
It's true.
John, what did you go as?
I went as General Veers, as I've mentioned a couple times. That's the costume I'm working on. It's easy for a short and round person to be, since it's not a constricting armor. It requires a certain height to really be in.
Awesome. And Katie, what did you go as?
I was Rose Tico from Star Wars The Last Jedi.
And I went as Imperial Stormtrooper Corps officer. So that's the officer uniform that is black. We had a pretty good time at the convention. One of my favorite parts was seeing all the other cosplay and visiting some of the merchant stalls too, and just seeing the amount of Star Wars stuff that they had. And of course, it wasn't all just Star Wars, but that was probably one of my favorite parts, is just seeing all the different costumes. John, what are some things that stood out to you at WonderCon?
The thing that I really like about WonderCon over San Diego Comic-Con is it seems to be a larger emphasis on the communities, the creative communities. At Comic-Con, San Diego Comic-Con, I don't feel like you get as many booths with independent artists, creating their drawings and artworks and stuff. San Diego Comic-Con's a little bit more corporate than that, and I feel like WonderCon is a great chance for these more independent and lesser-known artists to be able to get their work out and shown and be more visible.
Absolutely agree with that. Katie, this is your first convention in a little while, am I right?
Yeah, I haven't been to, like, a proper convention since, like, Comic-Con, like, 6 years ago, I think it was. Just because living in San Diego, I never felt the need of going to Comic-Con when it got too crowded, because I could just go to, like, the outside of Comic-Con, and, like, Carnival, like, Nerdist Carnival, and, like, all the different booths and stuff would be outside the con, too, that you could go to, and I felt that was a lot better for my budget.
And so how did you enjoy WonderCon this time?
I really liked it. This was the first time I really cosplayed as well, because I've dressed up as characters, but, like, never to the extent that I did for WonderCon. And I liked the interaction with people, and just, like, people's reactions to seeing me dress up was a lot of fun, which I hadn't experienced before.
Awesome. So I think we all had some pretty positive interactions when it came to the con itself. One of my favorite parts was we met a guy, Greg. We have an interview with him a little later in the program, but he had an Imperial R2 unit, and when he saw us coming, he started blasting the Imperial March out of its speakers, and it was kind of following us around. And that kind of fan interaction, being able to see other fans and, like, going up to them and interacting with them in character, or those fun little
Right. It's almost like going to like a live action role play.
Right, yeah, a little bit like
it's
that.
It's a little bit of the full immersion that you wouldn't normally get, especially as three adults basically going to a glorified Halloween convention.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Halloween convention and toy fair. Katie, you had some really good experiences with your Rose Tico costume.
Yeah, I did.
Tell me a little bit about that.
I think, well, going into it, I did have some reservations because I'm half Japanese, so like I don't look stereotypically Asian. I look like there's like something else mixed in as well as like partially Asian. So one of the fears I had going into it is that like because Rose Tico is an Asian character, was played by an Asian American actress, that because I didn't look stereotypically Asian enough, I would feel like people would take my cosplay out of context or like get angry somehow, because I was just in the back of my mind just because of how sometimes toxic feelings and thoughts and fandoms due to like race and stuff like that. So I was just worried that I was going to be seen as like someone trying to like imitate an Asian person even though I am half Asian. But it didn't seem to be the case when I was actually interacting with people. I actually got a lot of people being like, oh my god, you're the first Rose Tico cosplay I've seen, this is so cool. And it was usually like a lot of Asian people, and then they were so like, oh my god, Asian American, so cool. You're doing Rose Tico, oh my god, I loved Rose Tico. I had a lot of fun because like there was a lot of people that were just like, oh, that's such a cool outfit, I need a photo. My favorite interaction though, by far, was with Collectress Cosplay, is I think her Instagram. And she was there as Leia, and then there was another person there as Padme from Attack of the Clones, and there were just like 3 generations of Star Wars women, and that was a lot of fun. There was also an Asian American author, C.B. Lee, who was there promoting her book. I think it was like Not Your Superhero is what it's called, and she was super excited that I cosplayed as Rose too. So it's just those interactions were a lot of fun.
That's super awesome. Yeah. I actually, this is the first time you're telling us about some of the reservations you had beforehand. So I'm really happy to hear that.
I had this fear that I wasn't Asian enough to play Rose. Because you know how a lot of people like, this is a huge deal for Asian Americans to have an Asian character in Star Wars that's like such a main role. And because I do have reservations because I am only half, and it makes me really insecure that people are going to say something,
Well, I'm super glad to hear that people were being accepting and awesome.
Yeah.
And you definitely looked like you were having a good time
it was a
while
lot
you
of
were
fun.
there.
I really enjoyed it.
That's pretty great to hear.
I've noticed that mostly in the Star Wars fandom, I don't really know much about any of the other costuming fandoms out there. The community tends to be accepting of who you are in the costume as that character, no matter if you don't feel like you fit the role enough.
Right.
Ian, you and I are kind of bigger guys.
Yeah, we are slightly bigger dudes.
I think that's mostly why we went with Imperial officer costumes.
It enhances your character.
And I'm in the same boat with you, Caitlin, where I am half Filipino. I call myself questionably Filipino.
Yeah.
We all know there are no Filipino characters in Star Wars yet. I chose General Veers as my costume. I don't look anything like him. I've never felt in the fandom that there was any negative energy pointed towards me because of I don't quite fit the correct look, I guess you could say.
I think my fear stems from not necessarily the Star Wars fandom, but more of like the internet culture when it comes to movies, because I'm very much involved in like how movies are made in the film industry, and so there's a lot of like backlash when they like cast a white person in Asian roles, and like I felt like I didn't know if would that be that same animosity if I put on Rose Tico's character because I'm half white. And, like, to some people, I know there's a lot of Asian American people out there that look at me and don't think Asian. And it's also, like, an identity thing. Like, I didn't know if because I didn't look completely full Asian, that I'm only half, if that would, like feel like someone else is encroaching on their identity and their success in having this Asian American lead in a Star Wars movie. And because like I do hear the need and want for more diversity, and I'm all for that. It's hard to want to cosplay something because like I always have that in the back of my mind, this idea of like, oh, we need more representation, but I don't want a white person playing this character. And I feel like it's kind of hard to cosplay based on just like what you are, because
right.
what I have is limiting. Like there's not a lot of half Japanese characters out there. Like I could probably play So-So from Orange is the New Black and maybe a gender bent hero from Big Hero 6. Like, and that's about it. So like going into it, I did have reservations because I know online the backlash and the discussions that people get really heated about when it comes to race and representation. So I was afraid that my white passingness would be a factor, and I was glad that it wasn't.
Nobody should feel, and this is one of the reasons why I really enjoy the Star Wars costuming community, is that they're very welcoming in that your race and your gender don't play into the character you're cosplaying is as much as other things. They're very accepting of or even how you appear. Like John and I were just talking about being we're bigger guys, but we're still welcome in the fandom. I've seen and Katie, you had reservations about your character, but they were still really welcoming.
Yeah.
And I think that outside of the internet trolls, once you actually get out there with the community face to face and walking around, the Star Wars community, costuming community, is super supportive about being inclusive.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I really enjoy about it. Well, so as we mentioned before, John, you and Katie both worked together on the Rose Tico costume. John, you did a good portion of the work. Katie, how was the costume for you? Was it being your first real cosplay?
I really enjoyed it. I might be new to the cosplay community, but I'm definitely not new to costumes, being a theater kid throughout high school and college. But definitely it was one of the more comfortable costumes that I've ever worn, mostly because it wasn't a corset and it was a jumpsuit and like pants and boots. So it was great. I really enjoyed it. It's just one of those things where like after an entire day of walking around, you want to be able to wear something that's on the same level as sweatpants, just because you're going to have chafing, you're going to have, parts of the costume falling off. It's just not going to be a fun, you're going to be sweating. It's just not fun by like when 5 o'clock rolls around. And just to have something that's just, it's easy, it's pants, there's my legs aren't rubbing up against each other while I walk,
It's easy, it's pants is probably going to be my new favorite tagline for anything ever.
It's easy, it's pants. It doesn't suck in my gut. Like, I don't feel like there's something holding my gut in. I can just let it out,
And that's one of the great things about Rose's costume is that it's, well, at least in the movie, the actual costume, it's a jumpsuit.
Yeah,
and on top of that, it's a little bit oversized jumpsuit. So it's designed to have a lot of room to just be comfortable in.
It's the
which was
costume
fantastic.
equivalent to a onesie.
Exactly.
To like
Now,
one of those like footy pajama things.
Now, there were a couple challenges to overcome with the Rose Tico costume, just because of the way John, you kind of designed and built it. And do you want to go over some of those challenges?
So this whole thing started because I was on Hot Topics website, and her
That's
universe.
Hot Topics, not Hoth
right.
Topics.
Thank you for clarifying.
Brand. The store, the department
Yeah,
store.
the one that used to scare me when I was a child, but now is full of pop vinyls and things that aren't goth. So I was on their website and their clearance section, and they had a Rose Tico style jacket being sold by Her Universe for like $30 or something dumb. And they were also selling a Ruby's TIE Fighter helmet, and that's kind of what I wanted to buy, but I also wanted an excuse to buy this Rose Tico costume in the hopes that I would meet somebody that would want a Rose Tico costume.
That was a fortuitous encounter there.
The main difficulty that we had with building this costume is that I live in San Diego and Katie lives in LA. The times that she was down here and the times that I were available never really crossed. So I was making this kind of guessing on everything.
Well, and then on top of that, the timeline in which you were starting to make it, I gained like 3 pounds. And so, like, I was worried that, like, I measured myself and sent you the measurements. And then I was worried that because I had gained weight, like, the measurements were going to be off.
Well, like I said earlier, the great thing about this costume is it's designed to be a little, like, open.
Bigger.
So the measurements you sent me, I added, like, 5 inches to them. And then just like, oh, if worse comes to worse, it will look a little baggy.
Right.
Which was totally fine.
And you actually, John, had to design pants to look like part of a jumpsuit.
Right.
So I remember we went on a adventure to a very large fabric store, and we brought the jacket in with us, and we were just going around, like, putting it up to every single piece of slightly yellow, ochre, greeny sort of fabric, trying to figure out, like, what the perfect combination was going to be for it, or the closest we could get. And the pattern design you had for the pants was designed after, let me know if this is right, kind of knockoff Jin Urso pants?
Yes. One of the big sewing pattern companies, Simplicity, routinely knock out a bunch of, I don't want to say fake licensed costumes, but I mean, this is
definitely not like...
Definitely not licensed, exactly. And the pattern that I used for it, that just happened to have the right kind of shape to the pants and had nothing to do with the brand, was a Jin Urso costume, which also had a pattern to make Zoe from Firefly. But the style of pants were almost exactly what I needed. And the original idea for the jacket was to cut off the lower half of it and sew pants to it to actually make it into a jumpsuit. But I realized that I really didn't want to deal with having to sew on a new zipper, removing the original zipper and then adding a new zipper. So then it just became a design of, we'll have pants that just go over the bottom of the jacket, and that seam would be hidden by her utility belt.
Right. And the belt itself you purchased and had shipped from, was it England?
No, they're mostly only available in England. They're British, they're called PLCE belts, and the Rebel Troopers on Scarif and Rogue One and Rose Tico, they actually wear them inside out because on the inside they have this weird loop.
Mm-hmm.
They're usually about like $30 to $40 to ship from England, and we just didn't have the time for that to ship. And luckily, last minute, someone in Pennsylvania threw one up for starting bid of $1.25.
Yeah.
So I won that bid, and the whole belt cost me $6.
Very
which
nice.
was so awesome.
The one thing that I was able to contribute to the costume, because I'm trying to put myself in a position where I'm kind of John's apprentice, but that really hasn't worked out on any projects yet. I usually just kind of make very, very minor contributions.
And bring me food.
And bring John food, which in itself is the greatest task of all.
Correct.
But I was able to... Katie, you were very insistent that we find a way to get Rose Tico's necklace.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it was one of those things where, like, I wanted to go all in, and the necklace is a huge part of the character, and, like, I was just like, oh, we need the necklace.
Right.
Ian, before you go on, I want to point out that I had many conversations with you about how we needed to have the necklace, and you were like, it's such a minor detail, no one will notice. Like,
oh,
no,
I still
part
stand.
Of the character.
I still stand by my comment because we were on a timeline that was ever shrinking. So I was like, look, if there are things that have to be sacrificed as part of us not having enough time.
How would they know that I'm mourning the loss of my sister Paige?
Yeah, it's so much deeper than.
Yeah.
look, I still stand by my comment. However, John had a great idea to buy foam.
Yeah, just
kind
off
of
the shelf craft foam.
What I ended up doing is taking a pin and cutting out the necklace shape and just lightly carving the indentations, the design into the thing. You know, it wasn't perfect, but certainly pretty good for the time allotted, because I did it like hours before the actual convention. But I was happy to get that done, to get these two off my back about it. Katie, you did a contribution to the costume as well. You took a wig.
Yeah,
and
I cut the hair.
yeah, but you did it really well. Like, you got the design down.
I think the hardest thing is that she kind of has like shaved like the bottom part of her head. I'm like, I can't shave a wig. So that was just like one of the struggles.
Kitty, I would say your biggest contribution to the costume was wearing it.
Yeah, thank you, John.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Well, I agree too. Like, you looked really good and we'll be throwing some pictures up of all the costumes we talked about in this episode. But it turned out really, really well. I was super impressed. But then again, John never ceases to amaze me with the craftsmanship of some of these costumes and props.
Yeah.
But like we said, it was an overwhelmingly positive experience. There were some great shops and some merchants there and some artists there that we really enjoy as Star Wars fans. Maybe we'll throw a couple of the people we brought stuff from down in the link description. Getting to see all the artists there was fantastic. I know, Katie, you picked up a piece of art from one of the artists, and a book as well. And John, you and I got a bunch of patches and pins, and I added some another Black Series figure to my collection. So.
Have you talked about your collection on here yet?
I haven't. I'm saving that one.
That's an entire show.
Yeah, that's going to be an entire show of collecting and the mania therein.
Yeah. And the controversy you're going to cause. Should they be out of the box? Should they be in the box?
Well, yeah, so it was an overwhelmingly positive experience, and WonderCon's fantastic. And
one thing I would like to add, but just before we end, is, Caitlin, I know you were nervous that you weren't, that people wouldn't accept you for being Rose Tico. The one thing that I was nervous about for the costume is that there was a lot of hatred towards the character in general, and I was nervous that somebody was going to come up to you to, like, villainify you, or, throw their shade at you.
It would not have ended well for them.
What I liked is that, at least when we were around you, that never happened. It was always overwhelming support and excitement to see the character. So I thought that was really cool.
And I thought that was really cool too, because that was also like an underlying thought, as well as the whole like representation aspect of it, but also just like because people online didn't like the character. But I feel like the support of other women, other Asian Americans, other people who were fans of Star Wars, seeing me dressed up as that character was way more impactful. And I think there were people that probably pointed at me and was like, oh my god, a stupid Rose Tico costume, but like didn't say it to me, which like made, I don't know if it means that like it's only something that's like on a fringe group online, or they don't want to tell me to my face that they hate the character.
Just the loudest group online.
Yeah, it's the loudest group online, and like I think the majority of people either don't care or actually just enjoyed the character, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it's a real important factor, and I've said it before, and I'm sure I'll say it many times again, is that usually the people who are the most negative are in the smallest group of people. They just happen to be the loudest, so...
And for the record, I enjoyed the character. And I also enjoyed the character because it's one of the few times in Star Wars where I feel like there's a character that kind of looks like me on screen for like the first time ever.
Yeah, it's an important issue. And I think it's one that we can do a whole other podcast on as well.
You think we can solve it?
No. No.
I do.
We could create one podcast to save the world.
It's going to be about Black Series toys collecting.
Yes.
Yep, that's the one. All right. Well, Caitlin, thank you so much for joining us to talk about the WonderCon experience. We would love to have you on again at a future date. And
only if they let me.
Only if we. Well, I'm inviting you right now. I have 50% of the power on this podcast.
Oh,
so.
Are you sure it's 50?
John edits it, so yeah, it's more like 40.
Okay. All right.
But as long as 60% John is okay with it, I think it'd be a great time.
I will take those odds.
I see what you did there.
Yeah, there you go. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us and talking about the whole thing and the experience, and it was a lot of fun. All right, Katie, we'll talk to you another time. Thank you.
One of the great things about the costuming community and prop building community is it's not just about costumes and wearing them to a con once or twice a year. A lot of these builders and costumers have banded together to create charitable organizations to not only share their passion for the costuming and the franchise and Star Wars in general, but to share that with those in need, to try to bring joy into someone's life. We talked a little bit earlier about the 501st Legion and the Rebel Legion, 501st being the also known as the bad guys doing good, who dress up as Darksiders and Siths and Jedi and Stormtroopers.
Did you almost put Jedi in the bad guy category?
Literally unintentional, as I was looking for our remote control to make sure the TV didn't turn off.
No, I don't believe you. You spent so much time telling people Jedi are bad guys, you actually believe it now.
So, yeah, the 501st, they do the bad guy thing, but they always go to do charitable things at hospitals and places like that. The Rebel Legion is very similar, with the exception that they do all the good guys. What Ian would call the good guys, I would say.
Yeah, what John would call the terrorists.
And there's a handful of other groups that are out there that aren't just these two groups. These two groups probably have the highest standards for their costumes. They tend to require mostly screen accurate costumes to join. But there are other costume groups out there, such as the Mando Mercs, who are a Mandalorian fan group, and they allow for customized armor and stuff.
We got to talk to some of these groups at WonderCon, and I actually was able to interview a couple of their members from the Mando Mercs, the Rebel Legion, the 501st. And if costuming is a daunting task for you and you're more engineered-minded, the R2 Builders Club was also there, and we got to talk to them. So I'd like to introduce a couple clips here, John, if you will allow me.
Solely with the caveat to just remind everybody that these were recorded on a phone in a very loud exhibit hall, so the sound quality isn't what you come to expect from a regular broadcast of Hoth topics. But we did our best to clean it up as much as we could, so please just keep that in mind.
So the first person I'd like to introduce is I talked to Dale from the Mando Mercs group. And here's what he had to say.
All right. So, real quick, what led you to the Mando Mercs in the first place?
The charity work they do more than anything, and then we have our own custom armor that represents us. The ability to customize my costume versus I love what the Rebel Legion and the 501st do, but I want something more customized.
Right, so a little bit more restrictive there.
Right.
Cool. What's your favorite part about coming to conventions with all these fans?
Interacting with other fans, and this is at regular events we don't get together in a big group very often, so it's cool to see people from other clubs and our own club that we don't see as often and hang out.
That's awesome. And do you have any advice for people who'd be starting off looking to join the Mando Mercs?
Join our forums. Join our forums and do your research.
Okay. I'm hearing that one a lot today.
Yeah.
Do your research.
It's like 4 a.m.
Do your research. Awesome. All right. Well, hey, thank you very much, Dale.
You're welcome.
And a big thank you to Dale and the Mando Mercs for taking some time to talk to us. The next group I was able to talk to was the Rebel Legion, and Michael was kind enough to step aside and answer a couple questions for me. So let's hear what Michael has to say.
All right, Michael, what led you to the Rebel Legion in the first place?
The charity aspect. Being able to put a smile on a kid's face when they could be having a rough day, or we visit a lot of hospitals, we do a lot of charity events, and seeing a kid smile is just everything.
That's
It's
awesome.
so rewarding to be in a club like this and be able to do that.
That's fantastic. And I have my notes in my pocket. I was like, I did this 3 times already. I can remember all my 3 quick questions. What were they? I think the second one was... what's your favorite part about coming to the conventions and seeing the Star Wars fans here?
The amount of the cosplay that's out there, the different costumes that everyone does, is so much fun, and it acts as a really good recruiting event for us to get more members, because the more members we have, the more events we can go to and reach and touch out to reach out to people.
That's great. And what advice do you have for people who are looking to get into the Rebel Legion, looking to start off?
Ask for help. We're here to help you. We're not standoffish. There's tons of help online, as well as, we're Southern California, we're Sunrider based, we have our own forum. Come to us, ask us what you're building. And the worst thing to do is to go out there and go buy something that might not be quite there and be like, well, what happened? So we're here to help, and
Awesome.
We want as many members as we can get. Like I said, it helps us go to as many events as we can go to. So ask for help. That's the biggest advice I can have, and we're all here to help.
That's great, man. Well, that's all I got. Thank you so much.
And big thanks to Michael and the Rebel Legion for answering my questions. Next, we ran into Lance, and Lance was dressed as a Death Trooper, and he's a member of the 501st, and he had some insights for us as well.
All right. So, real quick, what led you to the 501st in costuming in the first place?
I've always been a big Star Wars fan, and once I actually went out to a charity event one time, and I saw them there, and it's something I already kind of wanted to do, to build a suit. But then once I saw them that I could build a suit, be a part of this, and do the charity and all that kind of stuff at the same time, it kind of was a no-brainer at that point. So
Awesome. What's your favorite part about coming to conventions like this and seeing all the Star Wars fans?
It's interacting with people, because we do a lot of events, and especially if you're more of like an obscure character, you're not a Darth Vader or something. You can go to a million other things, and everybody doesn't necessarily know what you are, but it doesn't matter where you're dressed as here. Somebody knows who you are, and they're, oh, Death Trooper, I've got a T-shirt on, and you kind of things. So you see the real fans of
awesome.
all of the characters, not just the hero characters.
Sweet.
So.
And last thing, what advice do you have for any new cosplayers or people who want to start up, get into this community?
Don't be afraid just to jump right in it. This was my very first suit that I ever built. I'd never built a costume before.
Nice.
And it's a lot of learning, it's a lot of trial and error, but I mean, there's tons of resources out there. You can jump on YouTube, you can jump on any one of the forums for the 501st, and there's a ton of information available and people that are willing to help out. Even amongst us, we do armor parties, so if you're a up-and-coming member and you'd like some help putting your suit together, get in contact with the garrison, and we'll let you know next time there's an armor party. Bring all your stuff to somebody's. We pick one spot to all get together and help each other out and share knowledge.
Awesome.
So you just kind of have to jump in and be willing to take a bit of a risk. So.
Fantastic. Well,
Thank you very much to Lance and the 501st for answering my questions. I was also able to meet up with a couple people from the R2 Builders Club, and this is the club that builds the droids, the R2 units, BB-8s, and all of those other wonderful little droids you see wandering around conventions. James and Victor were able to answer my questions as well, so let's hear from them.
So, what led you guys to the R2 Builders Club in the first place?
Well, for me, actually, I went to Star Wars Celebration 1 in Denver, Colorado, and it was actually a pair of brothers that were the first to build an R2 named the Jansma brothers. And they made the very first homemade R2 that was actually made in 1977. And they brought it to that convention. And afterwards, I just went online trying to find people that made R2s. And I came across the R2 Builders Club. That was a Yahoo group at the time. Actually, I think originally it was an AOL group.
Okay.
And then it shifted to a Yahoo group, and now we've got our own independent website to run our group.
That's awesome. How about you, Victor? What led you to the R2 Builders Club?
Well, of course, R2's always been my favorite character, and I went to, in 2005, they had the promotion at Walmart for a toy promotion, and I went out to go to check out the toy promotion, and the 501st and Rebel Legion groups were there, and there was a R2 running around as well. So I asked the guy about it, and he told me about the club, and I signed up like the same day.
That's awesome. What is your guys' favorite part about coming to conventions with all these different fans of the franchise? Yeah.
No, I mean it. That's what's awesome is the fans' reactions. The little kids that are like, oh my God, it's R2, and they come running up and can I get a photo and whatnot. It's absolutely priceless. That's what it's for. Or like the families that have disabilities or something, and it's just the light that lights up behind the eyes when they see the movie R2 working and running and beeping and talking to you right then just makes everything just fire and makes it absolutely amazing.
That's awesome. How about you, Victor?
Same thing. You want to get a happy reaction. So R2 is supposed to make people happy, and when people are delighted and surprised to see him out there and they run over and take pictures, that's why we build them.
Awesome. And last thing, what advice do you guys have for people who are just starting out, interested in joining R2 Builders or any other fan group, and what are their first steps?
With the R2 Builders group, the Wally Builders group, the BBA Builders group, all of them, the major step is to understand there's different ways to build it. You've got to figure out what your way is going to be. There's ways that you invest time and money in tools, and you got to learn how to use the tools and things like that. And there's other ways where you can buy the parts and just assemble it like Legos.
Yeah.
One way it costs, you can do it as cheap as like $500. Another way, there's droids that get up around $20,000 for all the bells and whistles that you can think of. It's what you want to do. And like when you come to our builders groups, like if we're on Facebook, any of one of the groups, just type in R2 Builders, BBA Builders, Wally Builders Club on Facebook, you'll come across the groups. There's always a link to our websites, but basically there's a README page that just says you need to do your research. You'll understand how we built it. You'll understand that there's different ways to build it now, and you got to just kind of work out what's going to work best for you. Our always best recommendation, especially like with R2s, is build the head. If you build the head and you burn out, at least you've got a really cool head.
Yeah.
And a really cool prop for your table, something to talk about. And if you get past that point, then you can build the rest of it.
Awesome. Victor, any first-time advice for people interested?
Well, yeah, especially for R2 builders, definitely check out the website astromech.net. We have the blueprints for free. We have tutorials. People keep their blogs there. Parts are made available there. So it's definitely the first resource you're going to want to check out, astromech.net.
Awesome. Hey, thanks, guys. Thank you very much.
So while you were doing these interviews, Caitlin and I were off talking with the Rebel Legion guys, and this is actually the first time that I've been able to actually sit down and actually listen through those interviews without the mindset of just going through to clean up the audio. One of the things I found really interesting is that I believe every group said that what got them into it was the charity work, and or something to the effect of bringing smiles to people. Yeah. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, that was one of the common threads throughout all of the people that I talked to, and they're really into it and bringing that bit of joy and that fantasy of Star Wars to life is a big part of what they do. And it's definitely one of the reasons why I personally am considering joining some of these groups, and they just do a great job. Thank you very much to James and Victor and the R2 Builders Club for answering our questions on that other clip. I've got one more clip to play for you. We met a guy named Greg who had built both an R2 and was a member of the 501st. Unfortunately, we had some technical difficulties, so I only got the last half of this interview clip, but it's still pretty good, and I would like to share it with all of you.
What's your favorite part about coming to conventions like this?
Just the people. Like, people have a really good time taking photos and having fun, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's cool, especially the kids.
Oh, yeah.
When I drive the droid up to little kids and I start talking to them and interacting with them, just seeing their face light up, it's pretty awesome.
And if you had any advice for new people coming into the hobby of costuming and droid building, what would you tell them?
Enjoy the process.
Yeah?
Because, well, my droid took me a little over 4 years to build, so it's a marathon. It's definitely not a sprint. And so part of the enjoyment is the actual working on the project. Don't rush it. Do it right the first time, and then when you're done, you have a really nice looking product.
Nice. And what was your name one more time?
Greg Bellows.
Greg Bellows.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Greg.
And thanks a lot to Greg for giving us a little bit more insight on his personal experiences with these groups. Purely by coincidence, today before we recorded, I was on Twitter, and Sal Perales of the Now This Is Podcasting podcast, and his family is the quintessential Rebels cosplayers. He had some photos up of his family cosplaying in their Rebels outfits, and I was able to ask him if he had any advice through Twitter, if he had any advice for new people. And he said, quote, "I have lots of my build info on our site at theroguerebels.com, but I suggest reaching out to your local Saber Guild International, Rebel Legion, 501st, and Mando Mercs for lots of help and knowledge." So these groups that we talk to are and I think, John, you too, with your you mentioned how much the forums and the
Mm-hmm.
costuming community around made by these groups really helped out. It's definitely the way to go when you're starting out. Even if you're not ready to join a group just yet, the community's there to help you get into the cosplaying community, and there are resources out there for you in order to teach you kind of the basics and how to get into it. And I think that you and I have both benefited from that, and lots of other people have too. John, we do have a couple questions from our listeners. Kind of crazy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know people listened.
I know, it's weird. Well, we knew Mike listened.
Yeah.
So, our first question comes from our friend Kai. When you're working on a project and you mess up, do you start over or do you move on?
It depends. It depends on how far along I am, personally. If I'm working on, let's say, one of my blasters, and I accidentally cut it in half, say, which has happened.
You've cut it in half accidentally?
Yes, it's very thin plastic. Anyway, if I have a way to fix it, that is cheap to free, then I will go ahead and fix it. But if it's something that's beyond repair, I might have to just scrap it and start again and hope that I can salvage something from the broken thing that I can put into my new thing.
I think, personally, my opinion on that is it really depends on the project that you're working on.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're doing something that is, you're trying to get it approved, or you're going for super screen accurate, there are going to be times where if you mess something up, you're going to have to start over at least that section or that portion of it in order to get it to where you want it to be. But if you're doing something like a custom costume, custom character, or something that's a little bit looser, you don't have as many restrictions on your build, sometimes those mistakes or screw-ups can turn into really creative solutions and pieces of your costume to give it more personality, or come up with a unique way to make the costume more your own. So it really depends on what you're doing, if you would have to start over or not. That's just my opinion.
Yeah.
Our next question.
Oh, thanks, Kai.
Yeah, thank you, Kai, for asking a question, and we want to hear more questions from our audience. Let us know.
Specifically Kai, though.
Specifically Kai. You're on the hook now, buddy. Our next question, or questions, comes from Taylor in Idaho. Are the legit costumes made out of similar materials? If so, what are those typically? And he'd also like to know, how long does it take to make a high quality costume?
I know I have talked Ian's ear off talking about different types of Stormtrooper armor in the past, of random research of knowledge that are now in my head. Unfortunately, one of the things I've never really looked at is what the original ones were made out of. I'm pretty sure it's the same process as the new ones are, or the newer ones, which is usually a polystyrene type of plastic, heated up and pulled over a rubber or clay mold to create the armor, at least for Stormtroopers. Which, Stormtrooper armor made out of this plastic is light and, more comfortable than fiberglass, like my Veer's armor is made out of.
Right.
What was the second part of the question, Ian?
If so, what are the materials typically? And that
Okay.
really depends on your costume.
Yeah. Most Imperial armor stuff is the polystyrene plastics. I've had experience and have seen a lot of the Mandalorian merc guys use EVA foam to create their armor. Maybe not their helmets, but at least the chest armor.
And I think one thing to point out for these are a lot of the Rebel and Resistance costumes, and anything that looks vaguely militaristic. Chances are, some of those pieces are actual real world military surplus.
Yeah,
like
with slight modifications.
So the materials really vary. How long does it take to make a high quality costume?
That really depends on the builder.
Yep, I agree.
So I've been trying to make my Veer's costume as high quality as possible, and I've started working on it last year, just before Comic-Con, and I'm still working on it today. Just trying to get everything in the right shape, the right piece in the right spot, as close as I can to screen accurate. And my armor is 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces, 6 pieces if you include the belt buckle. The people working with like Stormtrooper armor, it's far more than the amount of pieces I'm working on. All the strapping is different. There are places you can go to just get bags of fasteners specifically for your Stormtrooper armor. So and in the interview earlier, you heard from the R2 builder that said it took him 4 years to build his R2 unit. Just to take the time to do it right. It all depends on how comfortable you are with the tools at your disposal.
And it's important to note too that we talked about all these resources out there, and our interviewees also mentioned there's a lot of resources out there, and it'll depend on the material and the time you're willing to put in, and the quality of the costume, the quality you want to make it. But no matter what your project, there's going to be a way for you to get it done, with some assistance, and that can just depending on all of those factors, it could vary in time greatly.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, John, this has been another pretty long episode of Hoth Topics.
And you say that right now at the hour and 50-minute mark, but let's see what happens when I get done editing.
Well, hello, my lovely Lothcats. This is John in the Edit Bay with an urgent update. You may have noticed that just now I mentioned that we are at the 1 hour and 50-minute mark in this recording. However, as I know you are checking the time codes right now, you'll notice that you're only at the hour and 10-minute mark. Why is there this time discrepancy, you may be asking yourself? Well, dear listeners, it's because here at Hoth Topics, we like to give you, the listener, the best possible podcast listening experience that we could possibly give you. That is why roughly 30 minutes of content was cut due to it not truly reflecting the main theme of our topic tonight. However, instead of just tossing this content into the garbage chute, we have decided to shut down the trash compactors of my computer's recycle bin. Do not fret, my terrified little tauntauns. Discussions and content cut in this manner will still be made available to you via our main podcast feed in a more raw, less edited fashion that I like to call Hoth Topic Nights. So until next time, my Wibbly Wampas, this is John in the Edit Bay, signing off.
Yeah, I still think we're going to have a longer than normal episode, but you know what? It was filled with a lot of good information that I think a lot of Star Wars fans out there are kind of interested in costuming and don't really know where to start. So hopefully we've been able to answer some of those questions, and if anybody has anything that they'd like to ask in addition, maybe something we didn't cover that you really want to know, go ahead and shoot us an email at hothpod@gmail.com or send us a tweet at hothpod. I think that's going to wrap it up for the day or night.
We will be sure to at least try to remember to add links to the different costuming groups on the website and in the link below if you're watching on YouTube.
Absolutely. We want to get those resources out to you guys, and if we can't answer your questions, maybe they can. So thank you again to the Mando Mercs, the Rebel Legion, the 501st, and the R2 Builders Club for being awesome and letting us interview some of their members.
A special shout out to our local clubs, Imperial Sands for the 501st and Sunrider Base for the Rebel Legion, who isn't just San Diego.
They're a pretty big chunk.
Yeah,
right?
they're I believe they said Ventura. I should have been paying attention when I was talking to them.
Absolutely.
And I cannot pronounce our local Mando Mercs clan name.
But so, we will put the link in the description.
It will be in the description, so please don't disintegrate me, you guys.
Before we say our final goodbyes, John, I want to start a new segment for the podcast.
Okay.
You and I started this podcast because we were inspired by a couple different podcasters who love Star Wars and love discussing it. And they, in turn, inspired, smaller groups like us to start out. So I want to start giving out some shout-outs to some podcasts that you and I listen to and we think are good, and ones that some of the bigger ones that you may have heard of that inspired us, and some smaller ones just starting out like us who you may not have heard of, and we think you should. Sound like a plan?
That sounds good to me.
All
Share
right.
the love, you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. So the first podcast I'd like to give a shout out to this week is Steel Wars.
Oh, classic Steel Wars.
Classic Steel Wars. Steele Saunders of the Steel Wars podcast. Every week he finds interesting people to talk to about Star Wars, from other podcasters to people involved in the actual productions, which is awesome. He was a very big inspiration to us, and probably the first podcast that I really started listening to in terms of Star Wars, that really got me interested. He's an awesome guy. He's got great guests on. He's currently on his 168th episode. If that seems like a daunting task and you're looking for one to start off on, I recommend episode 163, where he interviews Ben Mendelsohn, who played Director Krennic in Rogue One. It's a fantastic episode, great interview with a great actor. And Steele is a comedian by profession, and he's a really funny guy. So I definitely recommend checking that one out. One other podcast I'd like to give a shout out to is Dex's Diner. Dex's Diner is a new podcast like us. Brad, Katie, and Joe, not the Katie that we had on earlier, different Katie, host a new Star Wars podcast going over a number of interesting topics. They have a lot of great opinions, and they're super fun to listen to. They're just starting out, so give them a listen. Dex's Diner Podcast.podbean.com. They're on their 4th episode currently. I really enjoyed their 3rd episode, where they go over celebrating the women in Star Wars. We got into a little bit of a discussion about representation with our Katie, and I think these guys go into a really good episode celebrating that. You gonna check out any new podcasts there, John?
I haven't listened to a new podcast since we started this show.
Well, you gotta get on that, buddy. I can't be the only one. There are so many out there. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in to Hoth Topics. Go ahead and send us a tweet at HothPod. Shoot us an email, hothpod@gmail.com. Check out our website, hothtopicspodcast.com. We've got a Facebook page. We're on YouTube. We're on Google Play and iTunes. You can find us in just about every medium that you can possibly think of. We really appreciate you guys listening. We want to hear more from you. Just keep the questions coming, and we'll keep trying to bring you awesome, cool, new Star Wars discussions. Or just me yelling at John for telling me that Rebels are bad.
They are. I don't understand.
See? Stay tuned for more of that. I've been Ian.
I have to figure out how to create a theme song for our new segment. Does this piss off Ian?
That is John. I wonder if he'll add the song in there.
Oh, I won't.
Good. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you next time. James and Victor answered our set of questions for us regarding that. Let's start this over. This was so bad. It was so bad.